Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. It's very exciting to be doing a climate show with Joseph Dalio. If you don't know about him, Joseph Dalio participated in my first show on climate with Robert Felix and Dr. Timothy Ball, and it was the most powerful show that went all across the world and is still going across the world from last year. I've invited Joseph Dalio back because he is so knowledgeable about climate and all the different areas of climate. He has one of the most popular websites on climate in the world called icecap.us. Joseph Dalio was the first director of meteorology at the cable TV Weather Channel. He has over 30 years' experience in professional meteorology. He was the chief meteorologist at the Weather Services International Corporation, and he was senior editor of Dr. Dewpoint for WSI's popular Intellicast.com website. He's also been a college professor of meteorology at Lyndon State College. He's authored and presented a number of papers, as well as published a book focused on advanced applications enabled by new technologies and how research into ENSO and other atmospheric and oceanic phenomenon has made skillful seasonal forecasts possible. He is a certified consultant meteorologist, and he is elected a fellow of the American Meteorological Society. He served as a member and a chairman of the American Meteorological Society Committee on Weather Analysis and Forecasting. He is one of the most sought-upon people in the world to understand the context of climate, and recently with Anthony Watts, he has just authored Surface Temperature Records, a policy-driven deception, a blockbuster that will definitely introduce you to the deception that's going on with climate and weather. Let me say no more. Welcome, Joseph Dalio, to It's Rainmaking Time. Good morning.
Good morning, Kim. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Talk about this new report that you did with Anthony Watts. What is the essence of it? Why is it important, and why should everybody download it from your site?
Well, after the release of the emails in the UK and what is now called ClimateGate, those emails came out of the East Anglia University in the UK and were very damning to the scientific community that has been a proponent of man-made global warming. Our government and the EPA try to distance themselves from that report and from the IPCC in Congress, and pointed to NOAA and NASA, our own government agencies responsible for monitoring global temperatures, as being their sources of data because their data was so reliable. Both Anthony and I have been working for a number of years uncovering all of the issues with all three databases. Those are the three centers, the one in East Anglia University, NOAA's in Asheville, North Carolina, and NASA in New York City, where they compile global temperatures and each month announce what the month average temperature was globally and how it ranked. Now, we found they all suffered from the same issues, and we thought we needed to publicize the problems that exist with the NOAA and NASA databases to show that we can't trust those to make important policy decisions, especially ones that are going to cost a lot of money for corporations, but also for individuals at this time, especially with the economy under such stress.
But I have a question, because the audience could feel for a second that maybe this is a partisan agenda that you have. Is it a partisan agenda? Is it pure science? What is your main issue with NOAA and NASA and East Anglia?
Our main issue is the misuse of the science and allowing issues to persist that produce a bias, and it's not partisan. The people I've worked with are not any particular part of the spectrum. There's a wide range from far left to far right to center. This is not a partisan issue.
For some reason, it seems like in the traditional newspapers and broadcast agencies that it's translated as a partisan issue in the way that the area of climate is being spoken about. Mm-hmm. For example, a president gets up and says, the issue is resolved. Al Gore says, the issue is resolved. The science is settled. Why isn't the science settled?
For one, the factors that really drive the science are not well understood. The climate models are failing miserably in a lot of respects. They did not foresee the drop of temperatures in the last 9 years. We did see a blip up this year due to El Nino, but temperatures had been declining from 2001 to 2009, and even Phil Jones of the East Anglia Climate Research Unit admitted to a cooling of 0.12 degrees Celsius globally.
What does that mean to us?
It means, remember, that during this whole time, CO2 has been increasing, and they said that the only factor of importance was CO2, and you can ignore the sun and all of the other factors. CO2 is going to produce this dramatic accelerating temperature rise, and if indeed over a decade, in fact, even Phil Jones admitted going back to 1995, there's no statistical warming. There's no warming, even though CO2 is increasing, then CO2 can't be driving the climate bus. It can't be the only factor that we need to worry about. There are other natural factors that are overriding any influence of man.
Talk about that, because, when I was growing up, Joe, I always remember reading and hearing about the danger of carbon dioxide, CO2. Is it dangerous? Is it not? Give us the essence of what it is and what it isn't so we get it. Because most of us are scared of it. We grew up hearing it's terrible.
When we see these pictures of these belching smokestacks, even though the smoke that comes out is not, for the most part, anything but water vapor that's condensing, carbon dioxide is an invisible gas, it is not producing a significant effect on temperature. And in fact, it is a tremendous benefit. NASA identified over the last 50 years a 30% increase in crop yields with 10% more arable lands due to CO2. We're finding that CO2 in Washington, D.C. area, they're finding the trees are growing 2 to 4 times faster than they did 50 years ago thanks to the CO2, because CO2 is an important factor in photosynthesis. CO2, water, and sunshine build plant cells, and so with more CO2, plants thrive. In the greenhouses where they grow the plants that you buy in the spring that you put in your garden, they pump in CO2 at 3 times the outside CO2 concentration in order to get more growth and to make the plants look more attractive and entice you to buy them. You wind up taking them home and they seem to struggle a little bit in their new environment. Part of that is temperature, but some of that is that they're not getting as much CO2. They don't do quite as well as they did in the nurseries. In a classroom setting, or say in an auditorium at a school, or during a talk at a conference where there are hundreds of people present, they've measured CO2 concentrations as high as 5 to 10,000 parts per million, and the atmospheric concentration is about 390 parts per million. So it gets very high in some locations because we breathe it out, we emit it in combustion, but we also are a significant source ourselves of the CO2. And it's not a pollutant, it's a plant fertilizer, and we've benefited from it. We've probably fed tens of millions of more people worldwide because of the increase in CO2 in the last 100 years than we could have had CO2 remained at very low levels.
If that's so, and I accept that that's so, and I've done other interviews which have demonstrated the science of that, how is it possible that the EPA last year deemed it a toxic pollutant? I mean, that's frightening.
Well, the EPA's finding was based on an analysis done by a team that had an agenda, and the agenda was to continue the effort to control carbon and also to control how we use energy and energy sources. The EPA is, despite many tens of thousands of comments back to their proposal, their proposed endangerment finding, challenging them on all these issues, stood their ground and proclaimed it a pollutant requiring regulation and control. There are a lot of lawsuits underway to try to block that.
I think they need to be thrown out, and I'll tell you why. They just allowed the spraying of toxic chemicals in the Gulf, and they did nothing about it. Nothing. That actually made the problem worse. Now they're telling us that carbon, something we breathe out and plants use for nutrients and food, is toxic. It's crazy. This is crazy, and this is the basis of this new cap and trade system. This faulty seed, this lying, deceptive seed of information is the underpinning, the underbelly of this new cap and trade system. And if people get that this is a falsity, they will get that the entire system that they're building, that they brought in the head of J.P. Morgan Chase Did you know that? A woman who was the architect for the derivatives market with one of the architects of Enron to help create this carbon system.
Yep.
That's pretty bad. I'm not even involved politically. I'm an environmental advocate. I've always been concerned about the environment. You're talking to somebody who was in shock learning what I learned on the last maybe 200 or 300 hours of research I've done. It's frightening what's going on, because if we're breathing out carbon and they're trying to regulate it and it's food for plants, then it's all about levels. Talk about the levels again. Let's separate apples and oranges on the carbon issue, and then I want to continue with you. You said that in some places there's 5,000 to 10,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide.
Right.
But in the atmosphere, there's 390 parts per million. So what are we trying to regulate carbon for? Is there such a thing as a dangerous level of carbon dioxide? And if so, what is it?
It's never been reached, but they think it's something like 14 or 15,000 parts per million. We do know that in submarines it's between 6,000 and 11,000 parts per million because the air is trapped in there. And then, like I said, in auditoriums it can be 5,000 to 10,000 parts per million. Of course, when you open the doors and people leave, it escapes and goes back to normal. It doesn't affect people in any way, but it does benefit plants that we grow and help us with producing food. Because in addition to causing more growth, when plants are more vigorous, the soybeans and the corn and wheat, because of CO2, the biomass is greater. They've measured in sugarcane an increase of 40% in tests in some fields where they've tripled the CO2. But it also shades the ground. It becomes more drought resistant. There are fewer stomata on the plant leaves because they don't need to struggle so much to take CO2 out of the air. That means also less water vapor is evaporated into the atmosphere, so water needs are lower. Drought is less of an issue. It has so many benefits that to try to not only control it, but take it back to levels from 100 years ago, which is virtually impossible because the primary source of atmospheric CO2 isn't man. Man does introduce CO2 through breathing and combustion and other action, cement manufacturing, so forth. But the oceans are the primary sink and source, the primary reservoir of CO2.
How do you know that? Explain it to us.
Well, scientists, geologists, and oceanographers that are focused on the oceans, as one in particular, Tom Segalstad in Norway, who I know quite well, talks about the oceans as being an infinite buffer for CO2. He said you could burn all of the fossil fuels on the planet and the oceans would take up the excess CO2 so that it wouldn't increase the CO2 by more than 20%.
How come that's not a frame of reference around the world so that people that are concerned about the environment can know it?
An inconvenient fact. Their models are built in ways that give them the desired results.
Like data in, data out?
Yes.
They're simulation models, which is different from verifying facts. Is that correct?
Right. And when they look at models and models don't verify with the data, then the data must be wrong. Not their models. They always go back then and fiddle with the data to try to make the data fit their models. And this has happened again and again. I could give you many examples. But as a meteorologist with 30 years experience and heavily involved in climatology over much of that time, including when I was a professor and taught climatology and microclimatology, we look at the data and we let the data tell us what the story is. For example, if we look at record temperatures in the United States, which aren't jiggered with in the data, we look at the record state temperatures, and there are 12 months in 50 states, so there's 600 records, and you look at it by decade. The 1930s stands out like the Sears Tower, and the 1980s and 90s had a little bit of a blip upward, and the 2000s are lower than any other decade since the 1800s in terms of state heat records. And yet they're trying to tell us that their models say that heat records are increasing at an alarming rate. EPA has had several statements and stories come out with that as a theme, and it is part of their endangerment finding as to why they need to take action now because of the threat imposed by rapidly increasing heat waves. Whereas when we look at the data, we don't see that. We see a unremarkable heat story in recent years compared to the 1930s, the Dust Bowl days. They have been taking the original data and they've been adjusting that data